The late afternoon sun beat down over Ouagadougou, turning the streets to gold and dust. In the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office. A hand-drawn map of Burkina Faso pinned to the wall behind him. It was not the trappings of power that defined him, but the quiet, unyielding resolve in his eyes. For months, whispers had been circulating through diplomatic circles. Whispers that a major foreign demand was on its way. One that would test not only his leadership, but the sovereignty of the nation itself. The message arrived not through the usual slow trickle of diplomatic cables, but as a blunt, unmistakable statement delivered by the U.S. delegation. A letter, bearing the unmistakable seal of the Oval Office, sat open on his desk. The words inside were as cold as they were audacious. The United States demands 60% control over Burkina Faso's gold and oil reserves in exchange for security guarantees and economic assistance. Traoré's jaw tightened as he read. The final line, failure to comply, will be met with appropriate consequences. Across the room, his Minister of Mines, Adama Khanat, paced restlessly. Mr. President, this is not a negotiation, it's a shakedown, he said, his voice barely hiding his fury. If we give them this, we will have nothing left for our people. They are counting on us to be desperate, Traoré replied calmly, his eyes scanning the letter again. They think the instability in the Sahel, the terrorist attacks, the sanctions, all of it has weakened us enough to accept humiliation. They are wrong. Outside, the hum of the city was mixed with the low rumble of military vehicles patrolling the streets. The coup that had brought Traoré to power less than a year ago was still fresh in the minds of Burkinabe citizens. He had promised to reclaim national wealth, to break the chains of neo-colonial exploitation, and to put the country's resources back in the hands of its people. This demand from Washington was not just a policy challenge, it was an existential threat to that promise. That evening, Traoré convened an emergency meeting in the war room. Around the oval table sat his most trusted ministers, military generals, and economic advisors. The air was thick with tension. They've underestimated us, said General Diarra, tapping his fingers against the table. They believe because we are small, we are weak. But we have allies now, Moscow, Beijing, and others who have been watching. Khanat leaned forward, his voice low but firm. We should reject this immediately. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. But a rejection will not go unanswered, warned Foreign Minister Salimata Diallo. We have to prepare for sanctions, for pressure on every front, financial, political, even military threats. Traoré listened, letting the room speak. He knew that defiance came with a cost, perhaps a heavy one, but to give in would be far more expensive. It would be the final surrender of Burkina Faso's sovereignty, the selling of its soul for the promise of American protection that history had shown was often temporary and conditional. Finally, he stood, his voice steady. This land, our gold, our oil, is not for sale. We have lived too long under the shadow of foreign hands. This is not just about resources. This is about dignity. And dignity, my friends, cannot be traded. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Outside the palace walls, the wind carried the scent of dust and rain, a reminder that storms were coming, both from the sky and from across the ocean. His sun was setting over Ouagadougou, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. In the presidential palace, a tense silence hung in the air. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young and resolute leader, sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, his hands clasped tightly. Around him, ministers shuffled papers and avoided each other's eyes. They all knew why they were there, and the weight of what was about to be decided pressed on every chest in the room. Earlier that morning, a secure diplomatic cable had arrived from Washington, D.C. The message was blunt, cold, and heavy with arrogance. The United States, through President Donald J. Trump, was demanding 60% control of Burkina Faso's gold and oil reserves. It was framed as a strategic partnership, but Traoré saw it for what it was, an ultimatum wrapped in diplomatic jargon. The message was clear: comply or face consequences. Traoré's ministers exchanged worried glances. Some whispered of the dangers, economic sanctions, trade blockades, even covert destabilization attempts. Others spoke of the opportunity, the benefits of aligning with the world's most powerful economy. But Traoré remained still, his eyes fixed on the gilded map of Burkina Faso hanging on the wall. Every mountain, every river, every mine. They were not just resources. They were the lifeblood of his people, passed down through generations. As the room debated, Traoré's mind drifted back to his own childhood. He remembered barefoot days in a small village, watching his father work the land under the relentless sun. He remembered how his mother would hum softly while cooking, speaking with quiet pride about how the gold in their soil had been theirs long before any foreign power had come knocking. The thought of surrendering even a grain of that gold, two outsiders, made his blood run hot. A sudden knock interrupted the meeting. The presidential aide stepped in, her voice low but urgent. Monsieur le President, the U.S. ambassador is here. He says it's urgent. Traoré took a deep breath, nodded, and rose from his chair. The ministers fell silent as he walked toward the tall double doors. This was not just another meeting. This was the opening move in a game that would test his resolve, his courage, and perhaps even his survival. When the doors opened, the U.S. ambassador stepped in, tall, impeccably dressed, and wearing a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "President Traoré," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "I trust you've read President Trump's proposal. I'm here to make sure we have your full cooperation. For the good of your country, of course." Traoré met his gaze without flinching. "Burkina Faso's good," he said slowly, "is not for sale." The ambassador's smile faded ever so slightly, and in that moment, the battle for Burkina Faso's golden oil had truly begun. The meeting with the U.S. ambassador stretched into hours. The air inside the presidential chamber grew heavy, not with heat, but with the weight of veiled threats. "President Traoré," the ambassador said, leaning forward, "this is an opportunity. 60% for America, 40% for Burkina Faso. In return, you get military aid, infrastructure projects," and Traoré cut him off. "And my country loses sovereignty over its wealth." His voice was calm, but firm. The ambassador's eyes hardened. "If you refuse, there will be repercussions. Your gold exports, frozen. Your oil exploration deals, canceled. International lenders, suddenly, uninterested. You will isolate yourself." Traoré stood, towering slightly over the diplomat. "We survived droughts, wars, and the plundering of colonizers. We will survive without being chained to foreign greed." The ambassador smirked. "That's bold, Mr. President. But boldness without allies is just suicide." When the meeting ended, Traoré returned to his private office. The sound of the city outside felt distant. He knew the threats were real. Sanctions could cripple Burkina Faso's fragile economy. But he also knew the cost of surrendering would be worse. Within days, the pressure began. Western news outlets ran stories painting Traoré as a radical and unpredictable. Anonymous sources claimed his government was unstable. Foreign investors began quietly pulling out, and behind closed doors, certain ministers whispered to him, urging him to reconsider, not because they believed it was right, but because they feared for their own power. One evening, Traoré, his closest advisor, Colonel Doumbia, entered his office. "Ibrahim," he began softly, "they will not stop. This is not just about gold and oil. This is about showing the world that no small African nation can say no to them. If you refuse, they will try to remove you." Traoré looked up from his desk. "Then they will learn that Burkina Faso is not for sale, and neither am I." That night, alone in the palace courtyard, Traoré gazed at the stars. He thought of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once stood where he stood, who refused foreign exploitation and paid the price with his life. Sankara's words echoed in his mind. "He who feeds you, controls you." By dawn, Traoré had made his decision. He wouldn't just reject the deal in private, he would reject it in front of the entire nation and the world. The stage for defiance was set. The morning sun over Ouagadougou was bright, but the air buzzed with tension. Rumors had spread like wildfire. President Traoré was going to address the nation at the Place de la Révolution. Thousands gathered, waving Burkina flags. Farmers, miners, students, soldiers all stood shoulder to shoulder. State TV cameras were set up, ready to broadcast live across Africa, Europe, and even the United States. Traoré stepped up to the podium, dressed not in a suit, but in a simple, traditional tunic. He wanted the world to see him as the son of the land, not a politician in a foreign uniform. He looked at the sea of faces, then into the cameras. His voice carried like steel. "My brothers and sisters of Burkina Faso, and to the world watching us. Days ago I was given an offer to hand over 60% of our gold and oil to the United States, to make us beggars in our own home. That offer came with promises of aid and protection." A murmur ran through the crowd. Traoré's tone sharpened. "Let me be clear. Burkina Faso is not for sale. We will not hand over our resources to any foreign power, whether it wears a crown, waves a flag, or signs its name as Donald J. Trump." The crowd erupted. Some laughed at the direct mention of Trump, others roared with approval. "We are told that without their money, we will starve. But we have survived without them before, and we will again. They can keep their loans, their threats, and their false friendship. We choose dignity over dependency." In Washington, the words hit like a thunderclap. Within minutes, clips of Traoré's speech went viral. African youth across the continent reposted it, calling him the new Sankara, but in political circles, the reaction was fury. That same evening, the U.S. State Department issued a statement accusing Traoré of spreading misinformation and undermining international cooperation. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. "You've just made an enemy of America." Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré received word that 2 Western mining companies were suspending operations. International banks began freezing transactions linked to Burkina exports. The economic pressure had shifted into full-blown retaliation. Colonel Doumbia walked into the presidential office with an urgent update. Mr. President, our intelligence says American operatives have been meeting with opposition leaders. They're planning something. Traoré leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. Let them plan. We will meet them in the open, and the people will know who truly stands for Burkina Faso. But as night fell, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled quietly toward the capital, and the real battle was about to begin. The moon hung low over Ouagadougou, casting pale light over a restless city. In the distance, the hum of engines broke. The silence, a convoy of black SUVs, their license plates removed, slipped past checkpoints manned by soldiers who had been mysteriously reassigned at the last minute. Inside one vehicle, a man in a tailored suit spoke into an encrypted phone. We move tonight. The objective is destabilization. Push the economy to the brink, and the people will beg for help. These weren't tourists. They were intelligence operatives, contractors, and local political players, all aligned to remove the one man standing between foreign powers and Burkina Faso's richest dot. At 2 a.m., explosions rattled the capital. The main oil depot, which supplied nearly 40% of the country's fuel, went up in flames. Black smoke choked the sky. The radio buzzed with urgent reports. Power cuts in the northern provinces, communications down in key mining towns. By dawn, panic had begun to spread. At the presidential residence, Colonel Doumbia burst into Traoré's office. It's coordinated, sir. Fuel lines, telecom, even the banking network. This is no accident. Traoré stood, his expression carved in stone. Then we respond as a sovereign nation, not as a client state. Within hours, the president went live on national television again. His words were calm but searing. My fellow citizens, an invisible hand is trying to make you turn against your own nation. They burn our fuel, cut our power, and hope we will bow. But I tell you, the Burkinab spirit does not bow. Behind the scenes, Traoré made his boldest move yet, activating secret agreements with neighboring Mali and Niger. A regional security pact, forged quietly months earlier, allowed troops and resources to be shared instantly. Within 48 hours, joint patrols guarded key infrastructure, and foreign operatives found their movements tracked. But Traoré didn't stop there. He announced that Burkina Faso's gold exports would be rerouted, not to the United States or Europe, but to allied nations willing to trade directly in African currency reserves. No middlemen, no IMF oversight. In Washington, this was seen as a declaration of economic war. A leaked memo from the U.S. Treasury called Traoré's move a dangerous precedent that could inspire other African nations to follow suit. And indeed, it did. Across the continent, leaders in Ghana, Tanzania, and even parts of South Africa began openly discussing resource sovereignty. The African Union called an emergency summit, with Traoré invited as keynote speaker. Still, danger lurked. Intelligence reports showed that several high-ranking Burkinab officials had been bribed to sabotage the new trade deals. Traoré realized that the threat was not only external, it was within his own government. The real test was no longer about rejecting Trump's demand, it was about surviving the storm he had unleashed. The air in Ouagadougou was thick with unease. Markets reopened, but whispers replaced the usual haggling. Everyone sensed it. Something was coming. On the evening of August 14th, the city's streetlights flickered, then went dark. Moments later, bursts of automatic gunfire echoed across the capital. The presidential guard scrambled into position. A convoy of armored trucks rolled toward the palace gates, not as protectors, but as intruders. Inside the palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the war table. Beside him were his most loyal officers, maps spread out, radios buzzing. Colonel Doumbia's voice cut through the static. Doumbia, it's the rogue faction, sir, funded from outside. They've got heavy weapons and foreign advisors. Traoré, didn't flinch Traoré. Then they've underestimated the people of this country. As the coup plotters approached, the sound of chanting began to rise from the streets. Thousands of civilians, miners, farmers, students were pouring toward the palace, waving Burkinab flags, their voices a wall of defiance. The coup leaders, expecting to intimidate, suddenly found themselves encircled by unarmed citizens. One rebel commander yelled into his radio, "We can't move. There are too many of them. They're not afraid." At that moment, loyal army units, reinforced by Malian and Nigerian soldiers from the regional pact, struck from three sides. The firefight was brief but decisive. By dawn, the coup leaders were in custody, their foreign sponsors' communications exposed for the world to see. Later that morning, Traoré addressed the nation, not from the palace balcony, but from the street. Among the very people who had defended him, Traoré, they wanted to steal our gold, they wanted to take our oil, and when we refused, they tried to take our freedom. But Burkina Faso belongs to no empire, it belongs to its people. We have shown the world that sovereignty is not granted by foreign powers. It is earned, defended, and lived by the will of the people. The crowd roared. Internationally, reactions were explosive. In Washington, congressional hearings erupted over the failed operation. In African capitals, leaders who once whispered their frustrations with the West began to speak loudly about a new era of independence. And in Burkina Faso, the rebuilding began. Oil reserves restored, gold exports redirected to partners who respected African terms, and new trade routes opening across the continent. For Traoré, it was never about gold or oil alone. It was about proving that even the smallest nation can stare down the most powerful and say, no. And in doing so, he didn't just change the fate of Burkina Faso, he lit a fire that could change Africa forever.